Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Blake Johnson. This week, the Secretary for Homeland Security steps down, a look at immigration detentions, and finally, analyzing trends in interior enforcement. Please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it will help more people find our show. You may also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. As always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. As you may have noticed, this episode feels a little different. Our fearless host and BPC Press Secretary, Jordan LaPier, is off this week, meaning BPC's Media Relations Coordinator received a promotion to acting podcast host. So who drew the harder job, CBP Commissioner and now acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan, or myself? Be sure to leave a review and let us know on Twitter. And with that, we have Cris Ramón, Immigration Policy Analyst, who you can find on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Hey, how's it going?
We have Katie Sullivan, Immigration Project Associate.
Hi, Blake.
Hi, Katie. And making their podcasting debut, Lucas Reyes, who is our Immigration Project spring semester intern and a student at Cornell University. Hi, Lucas.
Hey, happy to be here.
Well, with that, let's get started. Earlier this month, Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen resigned from her post as the head of the Department of Homeland Security amidst news that President Trump was unhappy with the continuing arrival of Central American migrants to the U.S.-Mexico border, and he's looking to take a harder line approach to addressing this crisis. The news arrived as U.S. Customs and Border Protection published its March 2019 apprehension numbers, which saw the number of family units increase to new levels. And with that, I want to turn to Cris Ramón to talk about this a little bit. So, Cris, what were the factors that led to Nielsen stepping down as Secretary of Homeland Security, and how do the new apprehension numbers fit into this story?
So basically what happened is that the Trump administration and President Trump was incredibly frustrated with former Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen because you had an incoming large number of individuals who were continuing to come to the U.S.-Mexico border. Media reports have been sort of stating that President Trump has not been happy with Secretary Nielsen or former Secretary Nielsen for the last couple of months on this issue. She clearly was capable of implementing the policies that focus on deterring these individuals at the U.S.-Mexico border, but in the end, the large number of individuals, including the influx that we saw in March, which basically we saw levels hit that we hadn't seen since, 2007 and 2008 for southwest border apprehensions. I think that was a precipitating factor, and more than anything else, I think he wants to take an even harder line on immigration.
Well, this decision had major political implications in the White House and Congress. What's been the political fallout?
So basically, Democrats, who have long been critical of Kirstjen Nielsen, especially after DHS implemented the family separation policy last year, they were very happy to see her, to see her go. They're incredibly concerned about the individual who might be coming in to replace her on a permanent basis. Obviously, right now we have former Customs and Border Protection Director Kevin McAleenan, who's now acting Homeland Security, leading up that agency. What they're worried about is that the replacement for McAleenan will be even harder lined on immigration. McAleenan does sort of have, at least enjoys a little bit of bipartisan support from both sides of the aisle in Congress. So there is that to consider. Republicans, for the most part, were largely quiet, but they did indicate in some instances that they were unhappy with the instability and the leadership that you're seeing in DHS. They just simply wanted somebody who's consistent, just to be able to provide a consistent policy. And just by being there for a long time, I think a lot of them are also getting frustrated with the fact that you're seeing, not only in DHS, but you're seeing across the U.S. government that President Trump has a lot of acting heads of these agencies. And I think they just want some more consistency in the leadership, not only at DHS, but in the rest of the U.S. government.
So apart from the difficulties that the administration may have in getting a nominee through the Senate confirmation process, what would a harder line policy framework look like for DHS?
So what I've been telling folks over the last week is essentially the administration has a couple of options on how they can pursue this, and the one that I think they're going to take is through regulatory changes. The administration has control over the regulations for implementing various asylum policies. And one of the things that have been floated is whether or not they're going to try to tighten the restrictions on the individuals who can try to, claim asylum or claim credible fear. That's something that we're going to see. Another key thing that we've been seeing is sort of agency-level policy guidelines. And I think what is being discussed is sort of this quote-unquote binary option where parents who arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border with their children have two options. They can either, at the end of 20 days, as mandated by a settlement agreement governing, the housing and detention of families, at the end of 20 days, they can either say we're going to stay with our children for more than 20 days and be detained indefinitely, more or less, or they have the option of being separated, and this is what's being floated as the binary option. But that's just one example of sort of an agency-level policy guideline that they're looking at. So that's really, I think, where we expect to see this happening, is where, they want to talk about legislative changes. Like, obviously, the president's been pushing to get rid of all these different asylum loopholes. And so, in immigration law and asylum law. But I think what's more realistic, given the fact that House Democrats are not going to, approve any type of legislative change, it's more likely you're going to see regulatory and policy changes.
Well, I believe that the Trump administration has floated a political pressure point this past week, trying to discuss ways of moving migrants to sanctuary cities and dropping them on the doorstep of Democrats such as or Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, that's something that, obviously there was reporting both from the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN that this is an idea that was floated last November as well as this past February. But obviously President Trump tweeted this out, and he's saying that this is an option he's going to consider to move individuals detained at the U.S.-Mexico border into these sanctuary cities. Now, the question is, can he, and is it smart? Obviously, there's going to be enormous operational costs to implement this policy. And obviously, it's an open question of why are we moving these individuals into the United States instead of processing either their asylum claims or the removals, and then if they don't have an asylum claim, return them back to their country. That's a question. Now, is it effective or not? I mean, this is sort of one of those things that you always have with the Trump administration, is that he'll start talking about a policy option, and all of a sudden the agencies that he's overseeing have to sort of retroactively develop a policy. So it's an open question of whether or not they're going to follow through with this. But if they do, expect obviously a very spirited fight from Congress on whether or not they actually have the funding to be able to do this and whether they should.
Thanks for that update, Chris. We now turn from immigration issues at the U.S.-Mexico border to interior enforcement systems. BBC is currently working on an overview of the American immigration detention system and the trends in interior enforcement, with the detention piece looking at why the U.S. government would hold non-citizens in detention and the system's expansion over time. Let's turn to Katie Sullivan now. Katie, so you've been working on this research. What is immigration detention, and what are some reasons that an individual might be detained?
Sure. Well, immigration detention is the practice of holding individuals in government custody for immigration violations. So things like illegal entry and visa overstay are reasons someone might be detained. Something I think is important to make clear here is that to remain in the United States without authorization is an administrative violation of the law, but not a criminal violation. Therefore, immigration detention is civil in nature, distinct from criminal proceedings and criminal incarceration. Immigrants face agency regulation and immigration law, not criminal constitutional law. One of the things that means is that they do not have a right to free legal counsel like someone in criminal proceedings would.
That's interesting. So now detention hasn't remained static, right?
No.
And so how has immigration detention changed over the last decade or so?
It's grown over the last decade. During the first term of the Obama administration, Congress imposed what some call a detention bed quota, which led to an average of more than 30,000 immigrants being held in detention at that time. The Trump administration has only further expanded this practice and is now detaining about 50,000 immigrants, which is a record number. That can be attributed to a larger move toward interior immigration enforcement by the administration, which, by the way, has significantly increased costs associated with detention.
So with those high costs and limited resources, what are some alternatives that the government can use to that practice of detention?
Yeah, they're called ATDs, Alternatives to Detention. ICE can use ATDs and sometimes chooses to do so when individuals are considered low security risks while they await trial. So we're talking about things like ankle bracelets or more robust case management practices. When ICE has used ankle bracelets in the past, it was under a program called Intensive Supervision Appearance Program. And they reported success. They reported that the program was significantly more cost-effective than traditional detention. It only cost about $5.16 per day per individual. They also reported that they were effective at getting immigrants to show up for their hearings. ICE's own reporting said that was about 99% effective, which is, that's the big concern people tend to have over ATDs. I should say that the budget for ATDs did increase in the 2019 appropriations bill. There was a pilot ATD called the Family Case Management Program, which provided immigrants with caseworkers to help them navigate the complex proceedings. That program was ended by the Trump administration in 2017, but was restarted by this year's approps bill.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that is important to add is that there have been some new developments on the government's capacity to hold immigrants in detention, especially on the legal front. Earlier this month, Attorney General Barr, he actually issued a new decision that he referred to himself. It was an immigration court decision that then he referred to himself that he released that essentially more or less modified the capacity of individuals who have been detained, especially those at the U.S.-Mexico border, to be released on bond. I think the implications of this case is that large numbers of individuals detained at the U.S.-Mexico border would have to be held mandatorily in detention. And this decision is going to kick in about 90 days or so of the decision. And I think this is going to have a lot of implications because I think underlying all of this is the question is, does the U.S. government have enough capacity to be able to hold individuals in detention? Obviously, with Katie's piece, we were looking largely at the interior enforcement system and that there is a system to sort of maintain a large number of beds to hold individuals. But when it comes to individuals being detained at the U.S.-Mexico border, especially families, there isn't enough capacity. We did a piece last year where we kind of projected what would happen if we had the increase in number of family unit apprehensions and what would happen with would exceed the existing capacity for holding families. And we saw that the number of apprehensions would exceed capacity. And so I think with this development, we're going to start seeing, I think, a little bit of some cracks in the system for holding individuals being detained at the U.S.-Mexico border, and our capacity to be able to hold large numbers of individuals. So like I said, obviously this piece is looking more interior enforcement, but there's going to be a whole lot happening on holding individuals detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. A lot will be happening there in the future.
Okay, well, BBC has also looked at major trends in the U.S. interior enforcement system over the last 2 years, including removal operations of undocumented immigrants and the role of the immigration courts and the role they play supporting these operations. So let me bring in our fearless intern, Lucas. The research you carried out fell into 2 categories, removal operations by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the immigration court system's processing of removal cases. So what are the key trends for ICE?
So the broad overarching trends are an uptick in interior removals and total removals over the past 2 years. And I mean, the highest number of removals we've seen over the 21st century were actually in the Obama presidency in 2012, 2013, and 2014. But after a slow decline in 2015 and 2016, interior removals in particular picked up in the Trump administration, and we're currently at 4-year highs on that account. What that means to me, and I think to the administration itself, is that the focus in Trump's strategy has shifted to a deterrent policy and just processing more removals through the immigration courts. I'm going to talk about this a bit later, but the number of removals processed through the courts is currently at an all-time high. And that's coupled with huge budget increases in both funding for ICE and funding for enforcement and removal operations, as well as funding for the Department of Justice's Executive Office of Immigration Review, which of course processes removals.
So let's actually go ahead and turn to the immigration court system. It's received a lot of interest from policymakers and advocates as a real choke point in dealing with our migrant crisis at this point. So what are the trends for the immigration court system? What do we know about the major backlog of non-citizens to be processed for removal? And where are we going with this?
So the backlog has actually been around for several years, but it's only recently gotten media attention because it's ballooned and I would say skyrocketed to almost, I believe, 1 million cases currently pending in the courts right now. And most people would say that the reason behind it is the general lack of capacity in the immigration system to process and manage migrants coming over the border. And a huge part of that is a deficit in judges. So for the past several years, the amount of judges hired by the executive branch has been fairly stagnant, and it was only in 2018 where we saw a massive increase of judges as the administration is trying to address the growing backlog, because most of the migrants coming over the border now, as opposed to, say, 10 years ago, are unaccompanied children, family units, and people seeking asylum, which have to go through the immigration court system in order to get their asylum claim filed. And the result of this has just been the backlog, essentially.
So the U.S. immigration court system's already having to deal with an enormous backlog where the Central American migrants are now just piling on to that. Do we have any idea how the border crisis will impact interior enforcement?
I think that as long as the border crisis continues, we're going to see a general continuation of what Trump's doing right now, which is essentially ramping up interior enforcement actions and generally making the system more aggressive. His current policy is to encourage deterrence, which is to just implement harsher and harsher measures in hopes of discouraging migrants from coming over the border. And so I think as long as there's congressional gridlock, and I mean, not to say that Congress isn't currently working on solutions right now, there's been no clear, united effort from Democrats and Republicans. But I mean, on the left you have the DREAM Act, and on the right you have reform efforts in the form of the RAISE Act. So there's individual efforts on either side. But until we see a comprehensive push forward from Congress, I think that the executive branch is just going to grow more aggressive and ramp up the implementation of the interior enforcement system to deal with these migrant flows and the border crisis.
Yeah, and I think the way to also think about it is, as long as this immigration court backlog continues to exist, it's going to be incredibly hard for President Trump to fulfill his interior enforcement goals, right? If it's taking 2 years for a case to be processed, and he's ramping up interior enforcement, this is just going to be an impediment to him actually being able to remove more individuals. And obviously, as you're having, like you said, more individuals from Central America who are being detained and then sent through the removal process through the courts, that only compounds this problem further. So I think, one of the things to think about as well moving into the future is to what extent is President Trump's enforcement agenda being held up by the courts, and to what extent what is he doing to try to improve the immigration court system? There are movements to hire more folks, but at the same time, recently he said, I want to get rid of the judges. So it's an open question of, is he going to commit to improving the court system and hire more immigration judges, or is he going to try to, limit it?
And on that note, we'll leave it there for This Week in Immigration. Cris, Katie, and Lucas, thank you for joining me, and thank you all for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you can find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Cris Ramón and myself, and produced by Emily Schrader. Tune in next time.